Round 1. Fight! Shoryuken! 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 Shoryuken!
This image has sat in the corner of my mind for most of my life. I was introduced to Street Fighter at a very young age since my parents owned a PS1 with Street Fighter Alpha. Even though I hadn't started school yet, I can remember the sounds, music, and art that left an impact on me. These characters and stages exist in some of my earliest memories. I remember making it to M. Bison and not knowing what was happening when I saw him teleport or use Psycho Booster. When I would end up revisiting the Alpha games much later down the line, those memories came flooding back, and it really helped me understand how something my parents bonded over in 90s arcades had been passed down to me as what would become a core passion of mine. I would eventually get into Street Fighter 4 and Third Strike Online Edition on the Xbox 360 in my teen years, but as I said, those memories of Alpha were different. The character portraits, fighter select music, announcer voice, animations, and stage artwork were something that took me into another world. Though I didn't have much of a grasp on how to play the game adequately, I didn't care, and I was just enjoying pushing buttons. It's one of those true feelings of nostalgia anyone can relate to. Now I can fully appreciate Alpha for what it is, and what it did for Street Fighter as a whole. However, there was one entry in the Alpha series that I wish I was exposed to much sooner. I know a lot of people, like myself, love Alpha 2 and have kept it alive since it released in 1996. I could talk about that game all day, but maybe another time. It wouldn't be until the release of the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection that I got to play Alpha 3. At the time, I thought it was neat, but it didn't grab me. The roster was bigger, and selecting your ism was a cool way to experience the game differently, but it felt odd in some places. Although the sprites are the same, the presentation and vibe of Alpha 3 is completely different from 1 and 2. If you've played them, you probably know what I mean. The first thing I noticed was the different soundtrack. If I'm being honest, I would say character themes from 1 and 2 are much better and more recognizable, even if some are remixes of old themes. The sound font itself is different and just has this feel to it. It makes me feel like I'm playing the next evolution in the series, something truly trying to set itself apart from the Street Fighter 2 OST. The Alpha 3 OST is passable, but not nearly as iconic. I do love the character select music, and some character themes are improved upon. The best example I can think of would be Rose. Other certain artistic decisions I like include seeing some of the other World Warriors remade for the Alpha art style. Balrog and Blanca have some great facial expressions and animations, and I simply can't get over how they drew Vega's portrait. It's amazing. This goes double for Eagle since his last proper Street Fighter appearance was the very first game, and I don't want to think about that game right now. Other details like seeing Cammy sporting her Shadaloo doll outfit ended up being a good call since that outfit is now considered one of her best looks. Some of the stages are simply great to look at with some nice references peppered in there. I always liked seeing Final Fight characters in Street Fighter either as playable characters or in the background. Aside from that, stages like the Ironworks Factory, the Military Hangar Bay, Akuma's Cave, or Dalsum's Village all have so much personality to them. You can tell stage artists had a blast making these, considering they decided to turn something like Sodom's bachelor pad into its own stage just to show off how much of a weeaboo he really is. And I can't talk about how much I love the game's art without mentioning Bangus and the way some of these characters are represented in his art style. So many new art assets were made for Alpha 3, and I'm glad he was the one behind it. In terms of presentation, one thing that was improved upon as a whole would be the HUD. It makes sense to shift the character portraits to the corner, so it's easier to focus on action taking place mid-screen. The color palette overall is more dynamic compared to the warm and cool contrasts of the previous games. This decision makes sense considering the larger roster that has a more diverse palette in itself, and the fact your meter changes color depending on which ism you're using. It also just makes better use of space on the screen, considering a new meter for Guard Crush was added to the center below the timer. As a side note, I would say Guard Crush is a welcome addition since it almost forces players to be smart about defensive options and reversals. Though the game has been played for a long time, and players have learned how to consistently Guard Crush when using Vism. That's just the nature of older titles that allowed for this type of creativity. But that doesn't mean it invalidates the Guard Crush meter. When it starts flashing, it sparks this sense of urgency, where you need to make a decision instead of just holding down back in the corner the whole time. Do you go for an alpha counter or try to DP or reversal grab, hoping to capitalize on gaps in your opponent's pressure, or do you mistakenly guard for too long and need a full combo? Anytime a game allows for defensive mechanics and mind games that add depth or build upon already good defensive options, I can appreciate that. The biggest thing that sets Alpha 3 apart is its roster. Now that we have Upper on the Capcom Fighting Collection 2, with the 4 exclusive characters from Max, that brings the roster up to 37, not that far behind Street Fighter V with 45 characters, and Ultra Street Fighter 4 with 44. Given each of these characters can be played in 3 different styles, that brings the roster up to an effective 111, and allows for seemingly endless matchups. And I want to go ahead and address this. Yes, I am playing on the Capcom Fighting Collection 2 for convenience, and no, I do not condemn anyone for seeking out older games via emulation. Emulation, in my opinion, is a vital tool for keeping many retro libraries alive, whether it's done in an official or unofficial manner. Not everyone wants to resort to emulation or figure it out for themselves, and developers know that, and attempt to give players a comparable alternative. It's great that so many people who didn't have an arcade near them can now experience the games in this collection and others, albeit some of those collections have their issues. People should be able to play however they want, and Capcom has done a great job with their last few arcade collections. It's always fascinating to me seeing how some games change from one entry to the next. Do the developers want to stay with a certain theme that made the original memorable, or reinvent it to go in a different creative direction? For me, Alpha 3 walks this line. When I think of the game, I always associate it with the first two, but I'm also always excited to play it because it does one thing incredibly well, and that's the sheer amount of content in the game. Every time I feel like getting back into it, I look at the roster and think of giving another character a try and seeing what they're capable of. Or I could go back to either survival or dramatic battle to experience something different. Or I could even select a different mode to mess around with playing against friends. Ah yes, I always wanted to take Alpha 3 characters and strip them down to vanilla Street Fighter 2 versions with no supers and no air blocking. The point is, Alpha 3 is an incredible game that I wish I had the opportunity to play sooner. It puts me in a good mood when I think about playing it, and I hope anyone wanting to get into it feels the same way. It takes a little of the old, a little of the new, and becomes this full package of variety that lets players run wild with ideas for combos, setups, strategies, and is incredibly single-player friendly as well. All in all, Alpha 3 was a proper send-off to the Alpha series while New Generation was struggling to impress longtime fans, and I will always appreciate it for that. Thank you for watching.